One of the big mysteries in the book of Ecclesiastes is just who wrote it. It's introduced the words of the preacher, and then the name of the preacher is never given. And then we get 12 chapters of a sermon from this preacher, but we never get his name. Well, there are several clues in the text of the book that I believe give us a definitive answer about who wrote it. First is that very first verse. It says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So we know this person is one of the kings who came after David, Solomon or someone after him, all the way to the Babylonian exile. Well, that narrows it down some. And then later in chapter 1, the preacher is talking, and he says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now, there's something important. Only two men were king over Israel in Jerusalem. That's David and Solomon. Saul reigned before David, but he did not reign in Jerusalem. He reigned in Gibeah, a different city. And the kings who came after Solomon ruled over a divided kingdom. And the king in Jerusalem was not king over Israel, but was king over Judah. So only David and Solomon reigned over Israel in Jerusalem. And we already know that this preacher is the son of David, so it's not David then, it's Solomon. Furthermore, so many things in the book just sound like Solomon. The quest for wisdom, the fact that he says, I surpassed those who came before me in his greatness and power, so much of it just sounds like Solomon. So I'm convinced that it is King Solomon. It cannot be any other real person besides Solomon, because he is the only son of David who was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now, some people put forward a theory that is still plausible. The door is still like cracked open for it, but I don't think it's very likely. That is a theory that the whole thing is just a parable, like Jesus' story of the prodigal son. And the preacher is a fictitious Solomon-like character in the same way that the prodigal son is a fictitious character who teaches a true lesson. So if that theory is true, then that would mean this preacher isn't anybody and he doesn't have to fit any of those rules. I suppose that's plausible, but I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. It sounds like Solomon. He's at least presented as a Solomon-like figure, and the only real living person that it could be is Solomon. So that's why I'm convinced it's Solomon. Before I go, though, let me tell you why other people disagree. There are three reasons that very smart people believe it could not be Solomon. I don't agree with any of them, but I'll tell you what they think anyway. So the first reason people think that it could not be Solomon is that he says, I surpassed all those who came before me in Jerusalem as king, referring to the many, many people who have been king before him in Jerusalem. And these folks would point out, well, hey, actually only two kings of Israel reigned, but he's just the third king of Israel. Why would he refer to David and Saul before him as all those who came before him? This has got to be somebody far later who had lots of kings reign before him. I'm not convinced by that argument, and here's why. Yes, Solomon was only the third king of Israel. However, he was not the third king of Jerusalem. Many Canaanites ruled as king in Jerusalem before him. We meet one of them in Genesis, Melchizedek in Abraham's day, priest king in Salem, which is almost certainly Jerusalem in Canaan. Many Canaanites surely before him ruling. Cities had kings back then. It was very rarely nations in the Genesis era. It was cities that had kings in Jerusalem. About 450 years from Melchizedek's day to Joshua's conquest of Canaan when Israel came. So that's 450 years of kings in Jerusalem. Plenty for Solomon to say, I surpassed all those who came before me in Jerusalem. So I'm not convinced by that argument. Second reason people would say that it cannot be Solomon is that the preacher complains of injustice in his kingdom. And this argument goes, well, Solomon had the wisdom to do justice, 1 Kings says. And so there wouldn't be injustice in his kingdom. His kingdom was just because he was wise. And generally that's true, but Solomon was not all wise. He was just very wise. He was not all powerful, just very powerful. And therefore his kingdom would not have been perfectly just very just, perhaps the most just of all time. So we don't expect that Solomon's kingdom was 100% just. There was certainly some injustice in it. So it makes sense that the preacher would complain of some injustice being in his kingdom, even in his palace. The third reason that some think it could not be Solomon is the language. Now, this is an argument that is much more sophisticated than my understanding of Hebrew or linguistics or anything, but the argument is the Hebrew, when you look at it, sounds like it came from hundreds of years later in Hebrew, from a later era of Hebrew, not the era in which Solomon ruled. Well, there are two reasons I'm not convinced by that argument, even though I'm nobody's linguist and I do not know or recognize Hebrew words when I see them written from right to left in Hebrew. These are those two reasons. First, we are not troubled by the fact or the notion that there was editing done by inspired editors that did not change the nature of the work in the Old Testament manuscripts. We have lots of examples of that. At the end of Deuteronomy, which was written by Moses, we read the account of Moses' death. Moses could not have written, of course, the account of his own death. And so we trust that an inspired editor came back and edited that. That does not threaten our doctrine of inerrancy or the authority of scriptures at all. The 150 Psalms had to have been compiled by someone very late in Israel's history, not by David, because some of the authors lived after David. So they had been compiled later, probably by inspired priests after the Babylonian exile, but we don't know who. Someone gathered them together in an order that is clearly inspired. And so it's no trouble if some later inspired editor, maybe the same people that gathered together the Psalms, I mean, it's wisdom literature, edited the language in a way that updated it, but did not change its meaning. But that doesn't even have to have been what happened. Who knows what happened there, right? Because I think it's very plausible that instead, because Solomon was so prolific a writer, I think it was 1,003 songs he wrote, because he was so wise with language, of course he would influence the development of the Hebrew language. Of course, later authors would mirror his style. So it's not that he sounds like a later version of Hebrew. It's that later authors sound like him because he influenced him. He was the wisest writer of all times. Linguists track very similar things with the King James Bible developing the language of English. It actually changed the course of how the English language developed, and later works sound like the King James Bible for that reason. Something like that very plausibly could have happened, and I think it's very likely that it happened. So the fact that the language sounds to the ears and eyes of people smarter than me like it came from another era, that doesn't bother me either. So I'm convinced it's Solomon. The door is a tiny bit cracked open that it could be like a parable and a fictitious character. I think that's highly unlikely. And that's why in the sermon series, which we started yesterday, I'm calling him the preacher, because that's what he calls himself. The only strange thing about it all is that he doesn't identify himself as Solomon. And he does identify himself as Solomon in all of his other works. So it's strange that he wouldn't here. He wants to be called the preacher, and so we're calling him the preacher. You should know, though, that I'm convinced the preacher is Solomon.